By the mid-15th century, the Byzantine Empire had been diminished from the unrivaled superpower of the Mediterranean to a miserable shadow of its earlier magnificence. Its lands, which had stretched from Italy to Syria, now amounted to no more than the city of Constantinople itself, a few islands in the Aegean and the Peloponnese. The fall of the empire had been a slow and painful one, led by the pillage of Constantinople by the Fourth Crusade in 1204, sapped by ongoing civil wars, and asphyxiated by the relentless push of the Ottoman Turks. The Queen of Cities, as Constantinople once was known, had been the wealthiest metropolis in Europe, its golden domes and marble palaces a testament to Roman and Christian glory. By 1450, its population had dwindled to 50,000, a fraction of the 500,000 who had lived there at its zenith. Entire districts stood empty, their structures crumbling into disrepair. The great palace of the emperors, the former seat of Byzantine power, lay in ruin. The hippodrome, where chariot races had once entertained 80,000, still stood. Yet for all its decline, Constantinople was a symbolic treasure. The last vestige of the Roman Empire, the spiritual center of Eastern Orthodoxy, and the gateway between Europe and Asia. To the young Sultan Mehmed II, who came to Ottoman power in 1451, taking the city was an objective that transcended ordinary military desire. It was an overwhelming fixation. Mehmed II was just 19 when he ascended the throne, but he was no typical sultan. A scholar as much as a warrior, he spoke Turkish, Arabic, Persian, Greek, and Latin and studied history, philosophy, and war. He had been brought up hearing tales about Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar and wished to eclipse them. From the day he ascended, Mehmed demonstrated that Constantinople was his for the taking. Twice his father, Murad II, had the city under siege, in 1396 and again in 1422, but both times was unsuccessful. Mehmed was set to do what his ancestors could not. Plans were underway at once, putting together a war machine no Europe had ever witnessed. Mehmed was acutely aware that the legendary Theodosian walls of Constantinople, a three-layered wall 4 miles wide on the city's land side, were its strongest defense. These walls had fended off Arabs, Bulgars, and Crusaders for 1,000 years. To break them, Mehmed resorted to gunpowder. He ordered the Hungarian, or possibly German, engineer Orban to create the biggest cannons the world had ever seen. The outcome was the Basilica, a 27-foot-long bronze monstrosity that was capable of firing 1,200-pound stone balls a mile. It took 60 oxen and 400 men to move this monster, and its recoil was so powerful that it took 3 hours to reload it. Mehmed placed it alongside dozens of smaller cannons, ringing Constantinople with a circle of fire. However, cannons by themselves would not assure a victory. Mehmed also constructed Rumeli Hizari, a huge fortress on the Bosphorus, to sever Byzantine supply lines. He also built a fleet of 100 ships to blockade the city by sea and excavated undermining tunnels beneath the walls, forcing the Byzantines to engage claustrophobic countermining warfare. Additionally, he also constructed mobile siege towers and catapults to overwhelm defenders. When the Byzantines responded by stretching their famous iron chain across the Golden Horn to keep his fleet out, Mehmed replied with one of the most daring movements in military history. He had 70 ships hauled overland along greased wooden rails, bypassing the chain entirely. On April 22, 1453, Byzantine guards looked on in horror as Ottoman galleys appeared in the inner harbor, where no enemy fleet had ever breached before. The bombardment began on April 6, 1453. Night and day, the Basilica cannon and its smaller variants bombarded the walls, each shot shattering stone and shaking earth. The Byzantines, under Emperor Constantine XI and the Genoese mercenary Giovanni Giustiniani, fought desperately to repair the breaches, using wooden stockades, earth-filled barrels, and rubble. In the city, the situation grew desperate due to food shortages resulted in famine, causing disease spread along the narrow streets. Moreover, the morale declined as the defenders realized that there was no Western aid coming. The Hagia Sophia, the great cathedral constructed by Justinian the Great in 537 AD, was made into a shrine where priests held round-the-clock prayer services. Even the emperor himself walked through the lines of his soldiers, exhorting them to battle for God, Rome, and Christendom. By the end of May, the walls were on the verge of collapse. Mehmed, sensing victory, prepared the final assault. On the night of May 28th, there was a strange silence in the Ottoman camp. No cannon fire, no war drums. The Byzantines, exhausted but hopeful, wondered if the Ottomans were pulling out. Just before dawn on May 29th, Ottoman war horns shattered the silence. The assault had begun. First wave, Mehmed sent in his irregular soldiers, conscripts and bashibazuks, to soften up the defenders. They were met with Greek fire, arrows, and boiling oil, and were repelled with heavy losses. Second wave, battle-hardened, disciplined Anatolian soldiers followed next. They broke deeper into the city, penetrating in places as far as the inner walls, but the desperate bravery of the Byzantines held their line. Third wave, then the Janissaries, the Sultan's elite troops, moved forward. Clad in steel armor, with axes and scimitars, they marched in step, crying Allahu Akbar. Giustiniani was slain at the gate of St. Romanus. His retreat created panic among the Genoese soldiers, making a mortal breach in the defenses. One of the small side gates, the Kirkaporta, had been carelessly or traitorously left open. Ottoman soldiers, noticing the gap, poured inside. Panic spread like wildfire. The defenders, realizing they were flanked, began to give way. Constantine XI, knowing that the end was near, was not going anywhere. Removing his imperial regalia, he drew his sword and made a last charge into the Ottoman lines, crying out, "The city is taken, and I am still alive." He was never seen again, his body never recovered. Some said Janissaries slew him, others that he threw himself into the enemy, rather than be taken prisoner. A legend then grew up that he had been petrified into marble by an angel, and was asleep under the city until the day that Constantinople would be Christian once again. By noon, the Ottomans had breached the defenses entirely. The streets flowed red as troops surged into the city, killing and enslaving thousands. The Hagia Sophia, which was filled with women, children, and old people taking shelter, was turned into a chamber of nightmares as the doors were chopped open and the congregation killed or enslaved. Mehmed himself followed shortly, riding through the shattered gates. In a gesture of humility before God, he picked up some earth and scattered it upon his turban. He rode into the Hagia Sophia, commanding the slaughter to cease, declaring it a mosque. The conquest of Constantinople spelled the doom of the Roman Empire, a political institution 1,500 years old. The Ottomans renamed the city Istanbul and made it their imperial capital. The news saddened and shocked Europe. The Pope appealed for a new crusade, but there was no Christian power that could wage war against the Ottomans. Byzantine scholars who escaped to Italy brought with them ancient Greek and Roman manuscripts, which helped to fuel the Renaissance. For Mehmed, it was just the start. He titled himself Kaiser I Rum, Caesar of Rome, and the Ottomans became the heirs to the Roman tradition. His empire would stretch into the Balkans, the Middle East, and North Africa, and be at its peak under Suleiman the Magnificent. The conquest of Constantinople was not only a victory one, it marked the end of the medieval era and the beginning of something new. The Ottomans were now a world power, and Europe, in dismay at having lost it, looked west, thus beginning the age of exploration. For the Byzantines, it was a sad but unavoidable fate. Their empire had endured despite all the odds for centuries, but ultimately, even the most formidable walls were not sufficient to hold back the forces of history. And so, on May 29, 1453, the last light of Rome was extinguished, but its legacy would survive, altered by the conquerors who now sat upon the thrones of Constantinople.